Hello everyone and welcome to every episode of the Fairly Oddparents Season 3 Reviewed. Before we get started, I'm going to plug my Discord server. If you're interested, the link is below. I was left pretty disappointed by Season 2. Needless to say, I was cautiously optimistic going into Season 3. And I have seen most of the episodes this season, but it's been a long time, so I was practically fresh on every episode this season. So without further ado, let's get into Fairly Oddparents Season 3. Episode 21A, Ruled Out. Timmy gets annoyed about having so many rules to follow. My favorite part of the episode is this random scene with a sumo wrestler that doesn't seem to be there for any good reason. By the way, rest in peace Biamba. Anyway, about the episode itself, this episode has way too many attempts at jokes to be this unfunny. Like, it amazes me how much they try to be funny and still fail to get me to laugh, chuckle, or even smile. The house getting progressively nastier and the front lawn getting progressively more like a jungle was, I guess, mundanely amusing, and I guess the sumo scene was sort of amusing. After all, it was my favorite part. But everything else just couldn't get me to laugh, emote, or care in any way. And that's really a problem when you screw up a moral as bad as this episode did. Like, obviously the first part of the episode is going to show that Timmy's parents are over the top and have a lot of rules because they care about him. But here's the problem. That can't work if you portray Timmy's parents with their normal personalities. In this episode, they're morons just like in every other episode. So yeah, I'm on Timmy's side, and he's right to want them to stop caring because Timmy's parents are incompetent and don't know what they're doing. They're just as incompetent before the wish as they are after the wish. But even though Timmy is correct, he still gets put in a cage at the end of the episode. And there's two ways I could take that. The first way is child abuse, and the second way, which is the one I think they intended, is that it's supposed to be funny. But it's not funny, so the end result is something that's trying to be a joke, but is conveyed poorly. If Timmy's parents' rules get him put in a cage under the guise of caring about him, is that really considered caring? Cages are good at keeping you safe from the outside world, but there's a reason everyone's not in a cage. Yeah, we're starting out the second season in a row with a bad episode. And the way this wish gets unwished is really stupid. Timmy's parents don't start caring again because he unwishes his wish, it's because their care for Timmy overshadows the magic itself, which, come on, that's incredibly contrived. I'm not joking when I say Timmy could have said, "Welp, that's 11 minutes, the episode is over," and that would have been a more believable conclusion to the episode. I don't care if unwishing at the end of every episode makes the show formulaic. It works a lot better than whatever this was. This was the most jarring falling action to any plot I've ever seen, and that's not an exaggeration. Episode 21B, That's Life. Timmy's gerbil comes back to life and seeks revenge for not being fed. This episode is interesting. It's actually one of the few that I remember watching back in the day, and it certainly isn't without its problems, mainly in the beginning. The way this episode starts is pretty weak, with Timmy eating pizza that he claims is the best he's ever had. Nothing wrong with that, but then you have Cosmo and Wanda begging for some of it as well, which does not make sense at all, considering they could make some appear out of thin air. I get that it's used to set up the plot, but there's way better ways of doing that. But why am I being so nitpicky? Well, really, that's the only problem I have. I actually think this episode is good. The gerbil being evil and unkempt is a nice idea, and it does make sense when you consider that, it's dead. But even besides that, there are some things to like about its design. While the exposed part of its brain might be off-putting to some, I really don't mind it, because the Fairly Oddparents art style is so unrealistic that I can't be disturbed by it. I also like that this episode specifically puts the focus on Timmy's mother, which isn't something we see often. She isn't too deep of a character, and a lot of her jokes seem to be about how stupid she tends to be, but in this episode she's more of a layered character with hopes and dreams. One other problem I noticed, though, is with Timmy's dad. He's a maniacal douche in this episode, just looking to ride off of other people's accomplishments in order to beat the Dinkelbergs at something. He really didn't have to be here, and if the focus of that was humor, then they failed. But other than that, this episode has not much to complain about. Episode 22A, Shiny Teeth. Dr. Bender tries to steal Chip Skylark's teeth. Most of you probably know the episode from the song, My Shiny Teeth and Me. And yeah, it's a pretty good song. It's my favorite part of the episode after all. But I gotta be honest with you, before I saw the episode to make this video, I couldn't remember any of the actual contents of the episode. And after watching it to make this review, I have to say, I still barely remember the episode outside of the song. There were jokes I liked, such as Cosmo's word gag, Skip's Sparky Pants, and when the guy says that the janitor was the new Chip Skylark. As for actual plot, I barely remember what happened. The whole thing was really a blur to me. The plot goes by so fast, you're given very little room to breathe and take in what happened 10 seconds ago. The Tooth Fairy is just sprung upon us and just gives Timmy a bunch of equipment, and then we go right into this scene with Dr. Bender, and then, oh, now we're back at the music video set. It's very cluttered, and I think I know why. There's about 11 minutes worth of plot squeezed into 9 minutes so they could fit the song in there. I wouldn't exactly want the episode without the song because it is one of the best songs in the series so far, but at the same time, the plot could have used the extra time. I don't like having to do this, but I really don't know if I have an option. Because of the way this plot tries to put a square peg into a round hole to accommodate a song that was really good, I'm going to go off the assumption that the episode would have still been a quality episode with no song. If the song doesn't factor into my rating, this episode would be okay. But going off the assumption that the extra time would have benefited them if they didn't decide to have a music number, I'm going to give it a good. Just barely. And really, it's a hypothetical good. Episode 22B, Odd West. Doug Dimmadome, owner of the Dimsdale Dimmadome, wants to tear down Dimsdale Flats to build a mall. Could you imagine reading The Hobbit and then 2 chapters in it ignores the story to become a cookbook? That's essentially what this episode did. It abandoned a plot just to tell another one and haphazardly go back to the first one. Sure, they sort of connect the plots by establishing that Doug needs a deed to tear down the city, but other than that, the 2 plots we get are not very connected at all. It would have been fine if the episode decided to get to the point a lot sooner than it did, but because they don't, it just comes off as jarring. Now, I have to give the episode credit because it's actually pretty funny at times. Timmy's dad in general is hilarious with the few minutes of screen time he gets. The Steed steer joke was good, as well as AJ's computer. Side note on that last one, that quick gag is actually used for foreshadowing, which is nice to see. The jokes would make me think a bit and forgive the episode for its bizarre pacing problem if not for the ending. Timmy's dad acts like Dimsdale Flats was so important to him in his childhood, and then he just changes his mind suddenly and gives Doug Dimmadome, owner of the Dimsdale Dimmadome, his deed when offered $8 for it. What a slap in the face that renders the entire plot moot! That's actually starting to become a pet peeve of mine, because I'm noticing that more and more shows are doing this. You may think it's funny to just add that to the end, but it's insulting. You're admitting to the viewer that you're wasting their time. That alone was enough to push it into bad territory for me. Episode 23A, Microphony. Timmy disguises his voice on the radio to sabotage Vicky's business. This episode is one that I had mixed feelings on initially. In the beginning, you see the same Vicky enslaves children joke that the writers keep trying to make funny, despite the joke never landing. Sure, Vicky gets arrested at the end of the episode, but at no point does anyone besides the children she enslaved actually have a problem with her. None of those kids' parents really seem to care either. And that's another problem I have with the episode. The parents. Aside from their general stupidity at not knowing their children are enslaved, they also blindly do anything the radio tells them to do. These are traits I suppose would be in character for Timmy's parents, but pretty much every single parent is the exact same in this episode. My favorite part of the episode is the voice, which is done by Kevin Michael Richardson, so you know it's good. But I wouldn't exactly say anything in the episode is really funny. If they refined a lot of the rougher aspects of the story and added a few jokes, I could easily see myself finding the episode to be good. Unfortunately, what we got in the end was essentially a first draft. I have to say, it's okay. The flaws here just made themselves way too apparent, and it honestly makes me overlook the things I enjoyed here. I could definitely see someone liking this episode though, but I demand a bit more refinement in a story than what this episode has to offer. Episode 23B, So Totally Spaced Out. Cereal box toys called Giggle Pies infest Yuccopotamia. So you might remember Spaced Out from Season 1 and Totally Spaced Out from Season 2, and wouldn't you know it, they made a third one. Of all the episodes from the first season to make into a series of episodes, I'm puzzled at why they were so drawn to this one. The first 2 were boring and got okays. In fact, the one from last season was very close to getting a bad. So, based on the fact that I don't like that they keep trying this over and over again, you can probably guess that this one isn't going to get a good. One major thing I enjoyed about this episode is the concept on its own. Having Timmy go to Yuccopotamia to fight off these cute thingamabobs wouldn't make for a bad episode, and it makes sense because Yuccopotamians like things that humans hate, and vice versa. The problem is that story only gets to dip its toe in the water instead of actually diving in head first with the concept because of the stupid B-plot they have in this episode. They just had to have a B-plot with Mark and Vicky, and it's just so tiring. You know what the joke is going to be before it even happens, and it's the same thing over and over again. It's the same as the other 2 times they did it, and it wouldn't be as big of a problem if they didn't distract from something that needed extra time to develop. So many ambiguities about these creatures could have been elaborated on and their concept given more time to develop. But because every couple of minutes we have to switch back to the mark parts of the story, which just make me want to fall asleep. This yin-yang combination of equal parts bad and good balances this episode to an okay. And it's a shame because this could have been good. Episode 24, Love Struck. Timmy wishes for men and women to be separated. I have a real bone to pick with this episode. Let's start with the premise. This entire episode is about Timmy wishing for the entire world to be segregated. Yeah, pretty dumb. And when that's your main crux that the entire story revolves around, you have to put a lot more care into how characters are portrayed. This episode did not do that. Instead, we get 22 minutes of stereotypes, and not even interesting takes on the stereotypes either. Hey, did you guys know that every man on Earth is a disgusting slob? Yeah, well this episode takes that portrayal to a whole new extreme. I mean, would it not be more interesting to have men try to fight against other men who aren't like them? You could have civil wars break out between different factions of men and women. But no, this episode treats them like they're all the same. I'll put it this way, I would not be surprised if Steve Harvey ghost wrote this episode. And that's not even the main source of this issue. The main issue is that every negative stereotype in this episode is placed on men, and every positive or neutral stereotype here is placed on women. I mean, the women's side of the wall in this episode has an organized government, and the streets are clean and the cities are well organized. The men's side of the wall in this episode has trash all over the streets, a brown sky, and it's implied that no one ever bathes. Maybe this episode could work if both sides of the wall are in disarray, but then there's scenes like the one where Timmy's mom says that a waffle iron is useless, obsolete, and makes a mess, and then she calls it dad, which is not funny. And these implications come off as worse when you realize that this show is created by a man and was written by a team of all male writers that included the creator of the show. And that's not even the full extent of the stereotypes here. Cupid's in this episode, and his entire personality is basically boiled down to being a gay stereotype, which gets old pretty quickly. Also, the ending is pretty awful too. Timmy gives up a chance to be reciprocated by someone he actually loves just to choose someone he doesn't love that's been stalking him, and this is morally treated as the correct move within the episode. If the episode wasn't already stupid enough, they just had to throw that in there. It's a bad episode. One of the worst Valentine specials I've ever seen. Episode 25A, Cosmocon. Cosmo hosts a fairy convention in Timmy's bathroom. This episode is one that has a concept that just makes sense for the show. Every character has something interesting or funny to do. I especially like Timmy's dad here. He thinks his wife finds Crocker attractive, and there's a lot of funny jokes that come with that. Crocker himself is enjoyable here too. The scene at the end where he goes through the convention with the ice cream cones over his eyes so he can't see is a very cinematic scene at least. I wouldn't call it funny, but that's not to say this episode is lacking in jokes either. Every scene with Brittany in it is pretty funny, mainly because that's her gimmick. She's just there for jokes, and I have to say, it's a concept that works for the show. If someone were to ask me what peak Fairly Oddparents was, I'd show them this episode. Because what sets this episode apart in particular is that it actually uses the limitations fairies have to their full potential. Every joke and every plot point makes sense for the characters, and it does a nice job of giving exposition on who can and can't know fairies exist to new viewers. So yeah, it's a good episode. Episode 25B, Wanda's Day Off. Cosmo tries to prove he can handle a cockroach infestation while Wanda relaxes. This episode is one that I am sort of mixed about. On one hand, I like that it sort of plays with the concept of how much potential a stupid character has when put under pressure. On the other, it would be nice to see that without having to interject it with scenes of Wanda. We don't need to see the spa to know that she's relaxing. And those scenes on their own don't really add much joke-wise. 11-minute episodes don't really need to have B-plots, and it's something I'm noticing more in this season. Instead of baking one cake all the way through, you're essentially baking two cakes for half the time, which leads to both of them being undercooked. I'd much rather have this episode focus on Cosmo and Timmy, because not only is it where the meat of the episode is, but it's also where a lot of the jokes are too, and when these plots come together, everything is wrapped up way too quickly. In the end, what you get is really unsatisfying compared to what it could have been, which is why I think it's okay. If the focus was placed on one plot and one plot only, this episode could have had a better story and been a lot funnier. Episode 26A, Odd Jobs. Cosmo and Wanda create a website that gives Mr. Turner cooler jobs. I was skeptical about this one going in. I mean, it starts out with Timmy's dad throwing sharp objects at children. But that's actually what makes the jokes in this episode work. Part of why is catharsis. Since the whole episode revolves around Timmy's dad getting hurt at these new jobs he tries out, it makes sense for him to have to do something terrible in the beginning, so we actually want this character to go through some torture. I actually think it does get a few laughs as well. This episode could have very easily not had a developed story or jokes if they gave Mr. Turner too many jobs, but since we only see him try 3, each of them gets enough time in the episode. As for jokes, I enjoyed some, like Cosmo getting injured by a mouse cursor that's actually a running gag that gets funnier each time. Also, Timmy's dad has a kind of comedic charm about him in the ways he gets hurt at each job, and the fact that he's doing these jobs just so he doesn't get laughed at. If there was one joke I didn't like, it was the going to the bathroom in the spacesuit joke. That one gets used a few too many times, and it wasn't that funny to begin with. Even with that, it's not enough to take away from what is otherwise a good episode. Episode 26B, Movie Magic. Timmy tries to make an award-winning movie. This episode is one of those the world takes a dump on Timmy episodes, meaning every plot point and joke in the episode revolves around contrived conveniences used to only make bad things happen to Timmy. Needless to say, I didn't find that to be funny. It just doesn't work really because Timmy doesn't really do anything to deserve his torture. He gets filmed by his parents for their own amusement and his embarrassment, everyone leaves a screening of his movie, and he has to take a bad version of his movie to the film festival because apparently he's in the wrong somehow after all that. And even when he does finally get an award, he still doesn't get the girl in the end because it's not the right type of award. It's just sad all the way through, and the attempts to make me laugh just made me feel sorrier for Timmy. It's just torture after torture, and then the episode ends abruptly, with no loose ends tied. Were there other jokes sprinkled in? Sure. There was Tad and Chad's movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, which wasn't really funny because the show already has an Arnold Schwarzenegger parody as a side character that already gets plenty of screen time. It's a bad episode. I think if Sylvester Calzone were here, he'd probably punch me. Episode 27 through 29, Abra Catastrophe. Timmy goes on a convoluted journey to get back a muffin that grants a rule-free wish. Oh boy, here we have the first TV movie of the series, and at first I was quite conflicted on what rating to give this one. With most episodes, I know what rating I'm going to give them after 1 or 2 watch-throughs. This one, however, is one that I needed more than that, because there are a lot of things I like about this and a lot of things that I don't like about it. First off, the biggest flaw I think is the CGI. This episode really likes to shove it in your face for no reason, and it really did not age well. It just looks wrong, and the generous amount that they use really makes it seem gimmicky. Another thing I don't really like about the episode is the beginning part. The very first thing in this episode, aside from the intro, which by the way sucks because it's comprised entirely of CGI, is a shot of Timmy sleeping, and what follows is a series of movie parodies that he's inserted into. And that idea in and of itself isn't terrible, even though the premise makes up a huge chunk of the previous episode, but what gets me is that we know that part of the episode is a dream, which ruins the suspense of the scene after it. Are the movie parodies at least funny? I guess, sort of. They sort of remind me of the opening portion of Power Mad, which is just one of the greatest scenes in the whole series. Just not as funny or interesting as that episode. But because you know it's a dream, the next scene is essentially ruined because the weight that it carries is entirely dependent on you not expecting it to be a dream. Do I like the jokes in the episode? Actually, yeah. There's the joke of Crocker panicking and professing his love to Waxaplax, there's the spinach joke, there's the joke of Bippy always wanting bananas, and I also like the billboard where it says the population is dependent on Crocker's mood. Could the episode have been funnier? Sure, but the amount of jokes that are there is pretty good. Although, there are some jokes I could have done without. Like the fact that Timmy knows Vicky in the first place is his own fault just was incredibly cruel. And there's the minor nitpick that 2 years ago looks like 2 decades ago. I also didn't really find the cuts back to Timmy's parents trying to count how many lies they've told him to be that funny. They only waste time that could have been spent on, the plot. But for all these problems I seem to have with the episode, I still enjoyed a lot about it. Of course there's the jokes I mentioned, but I also really like how they play up Crocker's role as a villain. Crocker is probably my favorite character in the whole show, so I like how he really gets to be a fully fledged dictator-style villain. And this plot is really a great way to show that side of him, actually giving him the power of magic and seeing him win at something for once only to see what he does when he's put in a place of power. And the final ending fight sequence, while dragging on a bit, is really cinematic and shows some interesting animation when they're not using CGI. This episode in general is action-packed. There's something always happening, and there's a decent amount of comedy sprinkled in. For all its faults, I think that this still puts it on the lighter side of good. Episode 30A, Sleep Over and Over. Timmy tries to go to both Chester and AJ's house after they have a falling out. My favorite part is the Guy Moon rendition of Flight of the Bumblebee. It's set in a series of this episode's running gags of Cosmo naming a bunch of animals that have a bunch of bad things happen to them. Those animals are all named after characters from Jimmy Neutron, by the way, which I don't know if that's a coincidence or not. But about the episode itself, this is one that uses two premises that a lot of shows tend to get a lot of mileage out of. The being in multiple places at once plot and the friends having a falling out plot. Since last season's episode about having friends with a falling out was pretty bad, I'm not really shocked they revisited the concept again. And to their credit, I think they're both done pretty well. They managed to keep both sides of Timmy's struggle interesting and show the pros and cons of each friend, while alluding to the fact that, yeah, things would be a lot better with the three of them together. As far as jokes, the two main jokes of Cosmo naming the animals and the "I'd be insulted if you didn't" joke are pretty funny, and there are quite a few light jokes sprinkled in, pretty much all of which got nothing more than a chuckle out of me. And things like the guard dog fight I found to be more amusing than funny. So overall, this is a good episode. Episode 30B, Mother Nature. Timmy's mother wins a contest and becomes Dimsdale's new local weather person. This episode is one where they try to cram way too much into 11 minutes. First we have Timmy and Mr. Turner ignoring Mrs. Turner, then we have the townspeople forming an angry mob against Mrs. Turner, then Timmy has to wish for her to always be right, then it has to go to Mrs. Turner's head, then Timmy has to apologize, then there has to be this climax with all the extreme weather, and it's just way too much to try to cram in there. And because of that, very few of those things I mentioned were actually enjoyable to watch. First off, the townspeople and their angry mob were portrayed really poorly. Their anger is way over the top and outrageous, but I have the feeling that it wasn't supposed to be a joke. It's not funny, and they give no indication that they're trying to be funny, so I have to assume that they're going for a realistic as you can expect from the Fairly Oddparents, portrayal of an angry mob. And they're really unreasonable, too. They stormed the studio after one weather forecast. But that's what I mean, they could have had time to develop concepts like that if they made this episode 22 minutes. Another problem I have is Timmy's apology. Mrs. Turner accepts his apology way too early, and it's not believable at all. The fame gets to her head for maybe 2 minutes of the episode, and that's it. And when she just automatically accepts his apology, no questions asked, it doesn't hit like it's supposed to at all. What about jokes? I suppose some things in this episode were kind of funny, like the puppets, which were my favorite part of the episode. But Chechu Betcha's lines about being handsome are also pretty funny, but to be honest, the story is so rushed that the jokes aren't enough to save it from being a bad episode. Episode 31A, The Crimson Chin meets Mighty Mom and Dino Dad. The Nega Chin escapes from his comic book. This episode is the sequel episode to Mighty Mom and Dino Dad from the last season, which was an episode that was in that season's top 5. So, did this episode achieve the same level of quality? Unfortunately, no, it did not. It's a bad episode. I have a problem with the title of this episode. Now, it's not the only problem with the episode, and it's not what ruined it for me, but it was certainly bad enough to be a problem with the episode. It's false advertising. I mean, let's really think about this. The Crimson Chin doesn't even come in the episode until Timmy's parents have already lost their powers. So, nowhere in this episode does Crimson Chin actually meet Mighty Mom and Dino Dad. Nowhere! And the sad thing is, that would make for a more interesting plot than what we got. Essentially, nothing happens in the episode. Timmy wishes his parents had powers and they get them, only to immediately lose them and have a cop-out ending where all these different versions of the Crimson Chin beat the crap out of the villains. The conflict of the episode is resolved way too quickly, and what's worse is that they didn't even have time to have a fight scene. We just get a montage of freeze frames of different villains getting the crap beaten out of them. And the episode ends with the Crimson Chins helping Timmy clean up his room. That ending is especially stupid. Timmy already cleaned up his room earlier in the episode. Now, yes, they did joke that his parents blasted a hole in the floor and his ceiling, but no, the ending shows the Chins doing things other than helping him patch the holes, which was the only thing wrong with the room at that point. Everything else was clean. It's clear there were some proofreading mistakes in this episode, like the end where Timmy's magically in his superhero costume when there's no indication he changed clothes. And they even make a secret identity joke too. Just stupid decision after stupid decision. Episode 31B, Engine Blocked. Timmy wishes to be a car so his father will spend time with him. This episode has some major problems, so just buckle up as I run down the list. First off, the car that Mr. Turner buys is someone else's car that we have no idea whose it is. Vicky just sells it with no questions asked, even though it's not hers. Now, that alone isn't really that bad. She does get punished, but so does the owner of the car. We, the audience, never actually find out whose car it is, and never get any closure on the fact that this person's car is stolen and then it just gets destroyed. Some innocent person's car just gets destroyed for no reason. Vicky actually deserves not having the car because it means now she can't sell it to Doug Dimmadome, owner of the Dimsdale Dimmadome. But you know who got punished more than her? Whoever owns the car. Another thing I really don't like about this episode is Mr. Turner's apology at the end. He claims he didn't spend time with him in the car because it was unsafe. You could maybe convey that through foreshadowing, except they don't do that. And because of that, I find the apology to be very cheap and I don't buy it. Bad episode. Episode 32A, Most Wanted Wish. Timmy becomes the most wanted kid in the world. One thing I've always liked is when the Fairly Oddparents tries to do really fun action plots. This is one that doesn't quite hit the mark in that regard, but it is a valiant effort. The Texas cage match is the meat of the episode, and they don't waste time making it visually interesting. Not only do you have the visually appealing sunset, but you also have just the action itself looking very interesting. Obviously, I'm not looking for top-tier animation from the Fairly Oddparents, but I do think what we got in this episode was pretty good. I also think this episode was decently funny. The rock joke kind of seems cruel at first, but as the episode goes on, they build on it enough so that it's decently funny. The FBI and every state in the US wanting Timmy is also pretty funny, as it technically wasn't specified what Timmy meant when he said wanted. So, overall, I'd consider this episode good. It's kind of one of those where you can just turn off your brain and enjoy the madness that ensues, and every once in a while, an episode of the show that does that is greatly appreciated. Episode 32B, This Is Your Wish. Cosmo gets put on a TV show where the audience decides whether he should stay Timmy's godparent or not. Just based on the concept alone, I'm reminded of A Partnership from Season 1, and I think this episode sort of has similar problems. I'm already not a fan of Mama Cosma as a character, and that's no different in this episode. Sure, she does end up losing in the end, but the end really only restores things to the status quo. There's no punishment to be had. And another problem I had was that they never show us any legit reasons why Cosmo is a good fairy godparent. Sure, we've seen those moments in other episodes, but in an episodic show like this, they don't carry over. This episode is just a montage of Cosmo failing, so I can't blame the audience for almost wanting to take him away from Wanda and Timmy. He kind of deserves it. Just because he's one of the main characters, that doesn't automatically mean he's entitled to winning any scenario that's thrown at him. That's bad writing. As far as jokes, honestly, there wasn't much humor to be had in this episode. There's a joke about Timmy eating feces. Yeah. I was gonna give this one a bad, but honestly, the episode is more dull than anything. The other problems just add to the dullness. So it's an okay episode. Episode 33A, Betty Bye. Timmy wishes that people didn't need sleep. Fun fact, this is the first and only appearance of the Sandman, and I don't know why. There are situations after this episode where it seems like he'd at least get a cameo, but no, he never reappears again. Although I can't blame the writers for forgetting about this episode because honestly, this episode is pretty forgettable. The plot itself is fine, there's nothing really wrong with it. It's your standard Fairly Oddparents plot. Where my hang-ups with this episode lie are the jokes. I didn't find really anything here to be funny. The disco ball joke was one I didn't really get. The deterioration of Cosmo's face was disgusting, and Chester eating the pillow was just stupid. It's a standard, dull, forgettable episode, but at the same time, I can't really see much wrong with it either. Everything you expect to happen happens, and there's no real twists or turns, and because there are no good jokes either, it's just okay. Episode 33B, The Grass is Greener. Timmy runs away from home. It's kind of interesting to see this episode before It's a Wishful Life, because I think this episode sort of does that kind of plot before it does that kind of plot. And I like the way it's done. The ending was actually heartwarming, and the heartwarmingness hit pretty hard when you consider the beginning. For the quality of this episode, my one gripe with it is the beginning. How contrived the misunderstanding is kind of inexcusable. Writers who do that for a living can do way better than that. It makes for a bad episode. Is what I would say if the episode weren't so funny. That's how the misunderstanding is structured, basically. And I really do mean that. The episode has a lot of little remarks that are pretty funny. Each of the carnies has an interesting design, and they do enough comedically with them that they manage to make them memorable. The misunderstanding itself might be considered a joke, and if it is, that's one thing I don't find to be funny. But overall, the jokes and the ending where Mr. Turner brags about Timmy to Dinkelberg are enough to make it a good episode. Episode 34, The Secret Origin of Denzel Crocker. Timmy goes back in time to figure out why Crocker is so miserable. So here we have the third of 3 specials this season, and I have to say, this one is the best of the 3. The reason why this is so good is the story. This is probably the best story of Season 3 so far. Diving into a character that has a lot of intrigue behind him was a genius move, as it is a story that is worth the 22-minute runtime. Some shows with 11-minute episodes have trouble filling up 22-minute episodes, but The Fairly Oddparents usually has the opposite problems. Many of their 11-minute episodes should have been 22 minutes. If you haven't noticed, that's been a pretty common complaint this season and last season. With this episode, they finally chose a plot worth 22 minutes and actually gave it the full time it needed. And within the episode, seeing the reasons why Crocker is such a bitter person make a lot of sense. He's constantly trying to prove the existence of fairies because he lost his by giving away that he had them, and making Cosmo and Wanda his fairies is sort of predictable, but it's executed well enough for me to forgive that. I think all the little intricacies that are explained in this episode are pretty well done, because there are little to no contradictions to previous episodes. And it's a time travel plot that doesn't make me scratch my head, so extra bonus points there. If I have one gripe, it's that the episode does kind of end abruptly, but that doesn't really take away from this masterpiece of an episode. Episode 35A, Kung Timmy. Timmy uses Kung Fu to get back his house from Francis. Cartoons in general seem to be able to make martial arts work well as an episode concept. SpongeBob has a number of episodes centered around it, and a lot of them tend to be really good. Regular Show has the whole Death Kwon Do thing, which makes up some of the better episodes of Regular Show, and Avatar The Last Airbender is such a creative take on the fantasy genre, specifically because of the creative way it ties martial arts into its magic system. So, how well did Fairly Oddparents tackle martial arts? I actually think they did a good job. Obviously, with Fairly Oddparents' more stilted animation, you can't have fight scenes that go on for very long, as at some point it's gonna stop being visually interesting. I think the fight scene in the episode is just long enough, and they do have some nice visuals. The Morning Fog does a really good job of setting the tone, and some of the ways Timmy and Francis attack each other were visually interesting to look at. The episode was a bit light on jokes, but there were certain ones I laughed at. Some of Timmy's dad's lines and the fact that he got beaten up by Francis and had his lunch money taken were both pretty funny. And when Francis says he's going to eat and then kill Timmy's fish, that also got a laugh out of me. I don't really have any other gripes though, this is just a really solid episode. Episode 35B, Which Witch is Which? So once again we have an episode where Timmy travels back to a past version of Dimsdale in some earlier historical era. And the setup this time is even weaker than the one from the last time they did this. It's just Timmy and AJ arguing over who they get to make a parade float of. When Timmy goes back, Alden Bitterroot is made to look like Crocker, which, okay, a lot of shows do something like that where they have characters in the past be parallels of characters actually in the show in the present. The problem is, they were weirdly selective of which ones they actually wanted to do. Aside from Crocker, which parallels do we get? The mayor? Yeah, they didn't even make Dale Dim a parallel of an actual character, which is kind of stupid considering the guy he's being compared to is a parallel of an actual character. Maybe they could have had him be similar to, I don't know, Chip Skylark, Timmy's dad, Dinkelberg, I don't know. But if you have two characters at odds with each other that happen to be parallels or ancestors of characters in the future, or, I guess, present, you can't just do that with one of them. Is the episode funny? Not really. I could tell they were trying to tell jokes, but honestly, not many of them were funny. And the overall story is kind of bland and basic. This is actually a pretty forgettable episode. Is it bad? Not really. I'll have to give it an okay. Episode 36A, Pipe Down. Timmy wishes for complete silence. A lot of shows have done the no dialogue angle before, and unfortunately way too many of them use it as an excuse to have basically anything happen in the episode. It takes a lot of effort to do a different type of style and make it work. A lot of effort that many shows don't feel like putting in. How did the Fairly Oddparents do? They use the interesting style to make a fantastic episode. While the episode is a bit light on jokes, I don't really mind it. They get all their jokes out in the first part of the episode when there is still some dialogue. And during the meat of the episode with no dialogue, there are moments that are mildly amusing. I also like how they use charades at the beginning of the episode to foreshadow the resolution of the episode. I don't know if I'm just dumb or not, but I legitimately did not see that coming. As for the lack of dialogue itself, this episode really shows off the talent of Guy Moon. If you notice on this show, a lot of the sound effects are just short pieces of music composed by Guy Moon, and they really help liven up what could have been a very boring episode otherwise. The way the music is used is really creative and helps tell the story a lot better than the visuals can alone. If there's one thing that's kind of lame though, while I do like the way the resolution is structured, Cosmo being his stupid, unhelpful self was not something good to see. He's sort of turning into this character that's so stupid the rest of the cast would be better off without him. Not really much else to say other than that though. Episode 36B, The Big Scoop. Chester and AJ try to get a story in the school paper. Fun fact, this episode takes place during the Season 1 episode A Wish Too Far. Why? Your guess is as good as mine. It doesn't really change the episode that much, and it could have been written without taking place at the same time. It doesn't add much, but at the same time, I can't be too mad because it doesn't subtract much either. I do think the base idea of having Chester and AJ star in their own episode is a pretty cool idea. Sometimes it's nice to have side characters get the spotlight every once in a while. Cosmo and Wanda don't even appear in this episode, and this is the only time that's the case. Is it funny? Well, I think there's a decent amount of jokes. The toilet in the living room, Chester talking about the First Amendment, and there's even a reference to AJ saying he inherited the internet, which was in response to the quote I put on the slide of the original episode. The episode's story is a pretty good fit for Chester and AJ as well. Their perspective is kind of nice, and seeing them try to get a story in the paper does seem to be a good plot for an episode focusing on them. While I do have my hang-ups with the creative choice to have the episode take place during another episode, I don't really have any other issues with the episode, so I'm gonna give it a light good. And honestly, if they throw a few more jokes in there, the episode could have been really good. Episode 37A, Crime Wave. Timmy tries to get home from the comic book store while completely naked. So, you want to already start off on the wrong foot? Do what this episode does and lie to the viewers in the title card. Before the episode even starts, you see the Crimson Chin holding Timmy up riding this wave. But guess what? Timmy and the Crimson Chin, or really any character in the real world, never cross paths in this episode. It's false advertising, and you know what? The episode actually would be better if they did this. But they didn't for really head-scratching reasons. This episode, no matter which way you slice it, is incredibly light on story. So we have this plot that takes place in the comic book, which I'll get to, but then there's also the plot of Timmy getting back home while simultaneously naked. I think the latter was supposed to be the A plot, but who really knows? So, Timmy wishes he was at the comic book store, and because he's in the bathtub when he makes this wish, he gets poofed there with no clothes on. The entirety of this plot is just him trying to get back home. There is one funny joke throughout the whole thing, and that is these two kids who mistake him for a superhero named Naked Lad, who just happens to look like Timmy. But other than that, Timmy's plot can basically be described as him just trying to get home. Then we have the Crimson Chin plotline. So, apparently the pages in this book don't dictate the plot of it, despite no magic being placed on the book. What? Any other time, the book would be set in stone because Timmy wished for something to happen to the comic book. This is a giant gaping hole in the story, and it's never explained. And when H2 Olga absorbs the water, guess where it comes from? Timmy's bathtub. Writers, want to explain how that happened? I guess you could say because magic, but nothing magic happened to the book, so the characters in it shouldn't be able to interact with the real world. And maybe, just maybe, you think the two stories will join up at some point, but nope, we got two stories that are never connected, which is just lazy for 11 minutes. And because neither of them are strong enough to take up 11 minutes on their own, they desperately need to link up. It's a bad episode. Learn how to proofread before you send in your scripts. Episode 37B, Oddball. Timmy helps an awful basketball team learn to share the ball to stop them from being relocated. So this is one of those episodes that has a moral lesson. And by now you should know this show's track record with moral episodes is not good. First there was A Wish Too Far, which did an okay job. Then there was Boy Toy from Season 2, which was bad. And this season we had Ruled Out, Movie Magic, Mother Nature, and Engine Blocked, all of which were bad. So in general, this show doesn't seem to do well when it goes out of its way to teach morals. Unless I'm forgetting something, this might be the first good episode to teach a moral. The moral this episode tries to teach is that it's important to share things with people. Admittedly, this is a harder one to screw up and has fewer moving parts, but it was still done nicely, and they managed to tie it into the setup, with Timmy letting his dad play his video game, as earlier in the episode he turned into a vicious animal whenever someone would go near his game console. The one problem I have with this episode is that the game console just explodes for no reason. Maybe it would have made more sense for it to be destroyed with him and his dad were tug-of-warring over it, grabbing the console back and forth, or maybe Timmy drops it. I don't know. They could have had something other than just a spontaneous explosion. What about jokes? As far as jokes go, the main one of the episode is how bad the ball hogs are, but the Blubber Nuggets joke were pretty funny, and some of Cosmo's one-liners made me chuckle. Overall, just a really solid episode. Episode 38A, Where's Wanda? Wanda Goes Missing. Which is just about the most predictable plot synopsis ever. Yeah, so what do I think about the episode? It's a series of confusing decisions. First off, when they actually do find Wanda, she gets punished by having to spend the entire summer with Mama Cosma even though she never did anything wrong. Secondly, why is Timmy's dad wanting so badly to be a suspect? Like, I know he's stupid and that's supposed to be the joke, but unless he's actually the reason that Wanda is missing, that's not something he'd say. And sure, that's the highlight, but only because I guess it's funny when taken out of context. In context, there's no reason for him to be here, especially with the absence of Mrs. Turner. And you think the big reveal is going to be that, oh yeah, he's the reason Wanda is missing, but since he's not, there's no reason for him to be here. Other than that, though, not much sticks out about this episode. I'll give it an okay. It's kind of bland, and not many of the jokes were funny, and the reveal was just stupid. And it's kind of hard to care when the probation system isn't really explained very well. Maybe it was something they planned on expanding on in future episodes, but just forgot about. But to be honest, its omission sticks out like a sore thumb. Episode 38B, Imaginary Gary. Timmy brings an imaginary friend to life. So this is a really iconic episode. I haven't watched this season in a while, but this is one of the few episodes I remember. And one thing I think it really has going for it is Gary himself. He is a very memorable character. The design itself is iconic. And one of the key strengths of this character comes from the fact that he himself isn't really what's funny, but more the way other characters react to him. This is where a lot of the jokes come from. As a result, this is a more quietly funny episode. A lot of the humor is a bit more subtle, such as Cosmo meowing when he transforms into a dog, and Gary breaking a comb in half that says unbreakable. To be honest, without the scene at the end and Timmy's imagination, this might be a pretty bland episode. The episode certainly shines at the end where the relationship between Timmy and Gary is explored a bit more deeply. Sure, I might find the way he ends up dying to be stupid, and technically he doesn't really die, but if the episode gave me this good of a climax, I don't think I'm in much of a position to complain. And as a result, I'm going to give this a fairly light good. And this is a character that definitely wasn't explored enough, so I honestly wish this were 22 minutes. And from what I heard, he does appear later on, so that's really good to know. Episode 39A, Chip Off the Old Chip. Timmy swaps voices with Chip Skylark to get the lead role in the school play. This is the textbook definition of an okay episode. Every beat of this story is not just predictable, but super sanitized. There are no twists or turns or difficulties for the characters, and getting Chip to make the wish for Timmy takes almost no coercion whatsoever. And there's not really any jokes either. There's just a skeleton of a plot we're given and no jokes to excuse that. At the same time, though, there's not much that's disgusting or annoying or any bad morals, so I can't really say I dislike much about the episode, but there's nothing good here either, except the musical number. But I don't feel like it's good enough to bring up this episode in any way. And in fact, since you're kind of expecting the musical number, this is a Chip Skylark episode after all, that just adds to the predictability. Chip Off the Old Chip is such a boring, bland episode, and I honestly struggle to find things to say about it. Episode 39B, Snowbound. Timmy and Vicky get stuck in a snowy cavern. Since this is the last episode this season and I don't have that many notes written down for it, I'm not even going to try to build this up. Snowbound is a bad episode. Supposedly, the idea was thought of by Butch Hartman's daughter, and I can certainly see that. The base idea isn't something that can really sustain a Fairly Oddparents episode. She obviously wanted Vicky to be in this episode per the origin story, but Vicky being in this episode honestly sticks out like a sore thumb. It is glaringly obvious that if she weren't there, this episode would be better. She just drags down every scene she's in. This could have been an episode about Timmy helping his dad catch this abominable snowman, but no, we have Vicky shoehorned in an episode where she doesn't even need to be. And what's worse is that they try to justify why Mr. Turner would drive her to the ski resort in a really stupid way. Yeah, that joke may be the highlight of the episode, but at the same time it's used to prop up the flimsy premise this episode stands on. Honestly, no explanation is better than a bad one. And the worst part is, we get sympathetic Vicky. Timmy has no reason to want to help her get out of this cave, but because she has a sob story, they become friends? What? She used him as a snowboard! Of course she deserves to suffer and get left behind. Oh, and of course she goes right back to being a horrible person after Timmy saves her life, so yeah, this is another The Universe Takes a Dump on Timmy episode. It's just really awful. And that was every episode of Season 3 reviewed. Alright, let's look at the chart. Honestly, this was a bit disappointing. After Season 2, I was hoping for a lot more good episodes, but it looks like we have our second mixed bag in a row. If we compare Season 3 to the other two, it does seem to be an improvement over 2 slightly, but still isn't as good as Season 1. But interestingly, Season 3 does seem to be more polarizing, with more goods, but also more bads and fewer okays. In terms of viewing experience, I probably prefer Season 3 to Season 2. While the bads this season were pretty rotten, the goods this season were generally better than Seasons 1 and 2. Which means the rating this season is going to be pretty predictable. It's another okay season. But now for my top 5. At number 5, Cosmocon. At number 4, Pipe Down. At number 3, Oddball. At number 2, Sleep Over and Over. And at number 1, The Secret Origin of Denzel Crocker. I've already decided that the bottom 5 is going to be its own video, so I'm just going to leave you with this conclusion. I honestly think Season 3 was an improvement over 2, but not near the improvement the show needs. I'm excited for Season 4, but the longer this goes on, the more I fear Season 1 will be the only good season of this show. As always, thanks to Pie Guy Rules for the inspiration, and Fairly Odd Parents Wiki for the information. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.